All right. So I want to thank everybody for coming to our workshop titled Who Should Respond to Behavioral Health Crisis? Imagining a New Behavioral Health Crisis Response Professional. My name is Amy Watson. I'm a professor at the Helen Bader School of Social Welfare at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I'm also president of CIT International Board of Directors. I'd like to have my co-moderators introduce themselves as well. Jen?
Hi, my name is Jennifer Wood. I'm a professor of criminal justice at Temple University.
Leah?
Hello, everyone. My name is Leah Pope. I'm an anthropologist and an assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry at Columbia.
Michael?
Hi there. I'm a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University and a research psychiatrist at the New York State Office of Mental Health Psychiatric Institute.
So we've planned a structured conversation with a group representing key perspectives on mental health crisis response. I'll introduce this group in just a moment. The audience members will have their microphones muted during the presentation, but you're able to post questions in the question and answer box, and we'll try to address those during the session, but we may also address some of those that we don't get to after the session. We have the ability to do that as well. We'll also have some time at the end of the workshop for some live Q&A where we can invite participants with raised hands to unmute and ask questions. So we know that in the US, as well as many parts of the world, law enforcement has been called on to take primary responsibility for addressing behavioral health crisis in the community. However, in recent years, dissatisfaction with this arrangement across all stakeholders has led to calls to reduce or eliminate law enforcement involvement in behavioral health crisis response. What we've seen in the US is a push for co-responder teams, mobile crisis teams, and recently a lot of attention to the CAHOOTS model. However, these discussions around what to do has been limited to consideration of existing models and professionals, which to date have not proven adequate or responsive to community concerns. Thus, we felt that it would be a useful exercise to take a step back and consider what stakeholders in these events consider the important skills and response strategies for mental health crisis events. We've brought together a really impressive group that's representing people with lived experience, family members and advocates, law enforcement, mental health services, emergency communications, and emergency medicine. And we're going to walk through several types of mental health crisis events and discuss skills and strategies and concerns for each. After that, we're going to summarize the themes that came out of that discussion and consider what type of response options we might build if we were going to start from scratch. Throughout the process, we'll consider where racial bias and inequity might seep in and consider how to mitigate it. So now I'd like to ask our panel to turn on cameras, and I'm going to call on each of you to introduce yourselves. All right. Okay, so I'm going to start with Brian P.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brian Pete. I am the Chief of Police in Montpelier, Vermont. I have roughly a little over 20 years of investigative and law enforcement experience in the municipal and the federal level.
Kevin Fisher.
Good afternoon. I'm Kevin Fisher. I am the State Executive Director for NAMI, Michigan, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Full disclosure, I am also a CIT International Board member, and I am a mental health and suicide prevention advocate.
Okay. Stephen Hargarden.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Hargarden. I'm professor of emergency medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin. I'm delighted to be part of this panel. My experience has been in taking care of people in crisis and also interfacing with law enforcement, social workers, psychiatrists, and psychiatric social workers over my years of practicing emergency medicine. I welcome this discussion.
Pat Strode.
Good afternoon. I am Pat Strode. I am the CIT Advocate Coordinator for the CIT section of the Georgia Public Safety Training Center. And prior to that, I worked as Program Director for the Georgia chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness. Thank you for being here.
Steve Missio.
Hi, I'm Steve Michio. I'm the CEO of a company called People USA. We're a peer-run organization serving 9 counties in New York State. And I am also a member of the CIT International Board and also the chair of the Psych Rehab Association. And we're a peer run, and we run the Crisis Stabilization Center in one of our counties, as well as run 4 different peer respites in New York.
Okay. Sabrina Taylor.
Hi, I'm Sabrina Taylor. I'm the CIT training coordinator for the City of Phoenix Police Department. And I work on the regional CIT program for the this county of Maricopa in the state of Arizona.
Melanie Payne.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melanie Payne. I'm the Training and Development Manager for Portland 911 in Portland, Oregon. I'm also part of a team that created crisis intervention training for dispatchers. And I've been with my bureau for 15 years.
Todd Suter.
Hello, my name is Todd Suter. I'm a psychologist, and I am the director of CIT Utah, also a regional coordinator for CIT Utah in Davis County, the mental health regional coordinator, along with I have a partner who does law enforcement regional coordinator. We work as a team to provide the training and CIT program in Davis County. I'm also the director of intensive services with Davis Behavioral Health that's involved with crisis, MCOT, mental health court, commitment hearings, inpatient hospitalization. I've been with Davis Behavioral Health and a psychologist for over 25 years, and appreciate people having me on this committee. Thank you.
Thanks. And Mickey Reed.
I'm Mickey Reed. I also work for Portland 911 with Melanie. I've been there for almost 17 years. I'm a dispatch supervisor, and I work with Melanie on creating the CIT training for dispatchers for our city, and we're also helping train the state as well.
Well, thank you, everybody. I am really actually honored that you all accepted the invitation to participate in this panel. And now I'm going to hand it over to Michael for the first part of the discussion.
So what we're going to do is we want to really get the panel thinking about what are the skills that are really needed to address mental health crisis call scenarios. And so I'm going to very briefly present the first scenario, and I want us all thinking about what the ideal response would be. And I think as we do this, we want to not feel bound by what the current response options are, but rather use this as an opportunity to think afresh with new ideas. So we're going to walk through some mental health crisis scenarios, and I'll briefly describe the scenario, and then we'll ask all of you, the panel members, to share your perspectives on the skills and the response strategies that would be most important and most effective. So here's the first scenario. A call comes in to 911 from a mother. She indicates that her adult daughter, who has been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, is off of her meds and is in her room yelling and tearing things up. Her mother does not know what to do, but she does indicate that her daughter has no history of violence toward people, no weapons, and is not threatening. So given that brief scenario, what response strategies and responder skills would be most important for responding to this call? For example, what background, what training, what equipment, what vehicles, etc. should the responders have? And I think we're going to open it up to your thoughts, and then I'm going to change the scenario just a little bit and get your thoughts with a few additional details.
I'm assuming we just jump in. So, okay. We being a peer-run organization, get these calls often because we also have a mobile team, a forensic mobile team that is all peer-run as well in Westchester County, New York. And when we get a call like that, we usually get a call from a police officer that's in the community that doesn't want to be the first engager, which is a relationship that we built with the police departments. And so we will have our staff go in and try to engage, knowing that there was no history of violence, knowing that there really is no danger, and they will engage many times. We're about 98% effective in engaging situations like this, of getting the person to talk and relate, and through that mutuality, calming down to a level where a more coherent conversation may happen. We do have the police that are outside in the driveway, should we need that. But to date, we have not had that happen, and we've been running this program for 3 years. And other similar programs in the stabilization center have been the same, where if a police officer brings someone in that state of distress, we've often been able to talk that through as well.
If I may, I can to follow up on that. I would highly agree with that. I think that response to there's no law enforcement nexus. There does not need to be a law enforcement response to that. That if there are peer agencies or resources that are out there that can handle that, then the police can stay mindful and be on a standby, if you will. But I think that it can be handled without law enforcement presence.
I would jump in as well and agree with both the gentlemen who spoke. We have a similar model as Steve does, although we respond with a licensed therapist and a peer. We'll respond together as a team. And our primary purpose in this type of a scenario would be, again, to make contact and better engage with the client. One of the things we determine is the role that the parent could have. We said that her mother was the caller. We would try to determine the role of the parent and see if they may be helpful in the process or they may be a trigger. We also would agree that law enforcement, this situation is laid out that there's no history of violence, and that's not an immediate concern. We would not have law enforcement, and we would just respond as our team of professionals, healthcare providers. We would also look for information about if the person is involved with current care, if they're on a civil commitment, if they've been consistent with medications, if they have past hospitalization, if there are substance use considerations, and depending on the responses to those different questions, we would act accordingly and possibly activate other types of services, activate EMS if that's an indication. Would turn to law enforcement if things begin to escalate, or if there were some unknown pieces that we learned later on that would suggest violence or difficulty. But in general, our initial response would be with a licensed therapist and a peer to be able to engage the client, work toward de-escalation and crisis intervention.
I'd like to add to that. I do appreciate the role of clinicians and peers. I would also like to see some engagement with the family. Oftentimes as family, as a caregiver, and as the primary means of support. Sometimes we're left out of that equation. So seeing that the family, that mom has some resources and is connected to ways to support her daughter would be one thing. The other thing is it would be really awesome, and I'm sure this is the case in many instances, that the clinicians have been, and those that are responding have been trained in some sort of trauma response, because this is a traumatic instance and circumstance for not just the young lady, but also for the mom. And certainly, just being aware of where they can connect those families up to care.
Well, and I'll weigh in really quickly. Of course, I concur with all of the comments made thus far. I like what Dr., and I hope I say your name correctly, Dr. Sudor his comments because I like the idea of a licensed professional and a peer responding. And I believe I heard you say, as it relates to the family, having a licensed professional who can help assess what the involvement of the family member or caregiver might be, because sometimes, though we like to think that it's an asset, sometimes it's a deterrent. You know, sometimes family members don't always understand the traumatic situation or what that person in crisis is experiencing, and sometimes they can do more harm than good. So I like having a professional there to assess exactly what that involvement should be.
One of the things I appreciate the comments by Kevin and Pat. One of the things that's really interesting that you bring up is with our response system, there are times when it's really effective if we can kind of divide and conquer, so to speak. In other words, oftentimes the peer can meet with the client and be able to connect better or engage better often than the professional can. And that can be very, very effective because in my opinion, our peer can really be able to persuade and encourage maybe some trust or some open-mindedness or consideration of how their responses can help them ultimately get where they want to be. But often the peers are more persuasive and have a better ability to connect than the professionals do. At the same time, we're working with the family members to talk about some of those things that you both brought up. How's the relationship between the mother and her daughter? Is she a trigger? Is she a helpful person and can provide solutions? What's been attempted in the past? What's been effective? What's not been effective? Are there other things we need to know, like Pat mentioned, around trauma? And what are some of the hints or advice that the mother has in terms of how we can best approach her with hooks to try to hook her into the evaluation and triggers where we want to make sure that we don't approach those areas that might escalate the situation rather than de-escalate the situation. The other thing that's really interesting about this conversation is when crisis workers approach emergency situations, there's often consideration around HIPAA and confidentiality, and we're dealing with an adult child and what their rights are, and that can become a very delicate conversation. And often I will train our crisis workers on being very liberal in gathering information from the family and trying to gather as much information that we can get in order to make the best response and ultimately, both best short-term intervention and long-term intervention. But that's a really delicate conversation to have. And I've come across instances where crisis workers may say, well, I'm not going to talk to the family member because there's no release of information, or we don't have confirmation that the daughter would want her mother to be involved in this. And I coach and train our team that when we're talking about a crisis situation or we're talking about the possibility of potential suicide or aggressive behavior or an inability to care for oneself that may really leave these people quite impaired, to make sure that we're doing the best job we can first and foremost to take care of that client and make sure that we're providing the best care and the best response to that client and family as we move forward and looking for a solution.
I just want to toss out one idea that hasn't been discussed yet. And again, I'm colored by what we do here and what I know. And so the daughter being diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder here, that would most likely mean that she's assigned to a clinic. And all of our clinics have response teams. So what would happen here is our 911 dispatchers would send this over to the crisis line. The crisis line would identify that she has a care team and would send out a team from that clinic who already knows her treatment plan, knows her history, knows her mother, and they would go out and address the ongoing issue right there. So it's just another, ours is limited. Again, it's limited to clinic hours, and it wouldn't be a crisis response. It would be a response from the clinic. So just a little bit something different that I wanted to throw out there as a possibility.
And we have something similar in Portland. As a 911 call taker, they're going to take that call. As long as the mom believes she's not a danger to herself and others, we can go ahead and we'll transfer that call to the crisis line. The mom can work with the crisis line. They can send Project Respond, a team with mental health professionals. They have the ability, the Project Respond folks can call if they need assistance from police or want police to stand by. And we can send an officer. If crisis line can't create a safety plan, they call us back, and then we send one of our crisis intervention trained officers to help deal with a situation on the scene.
If I may piggyback on those recent commentaries on the 911 system, I really think that that's a way to start the discussions about a blunt response. We all agree that a law enforcement response does not seem to be appropriate, but starting with 911 and getting those questions and training of 911 dispatchers to make that triage decision in a very thoughtful way to resources that are available. Sabrina, you mentioned it. Mickey, you mentioned yours. There may be other community responses, but that 911 system is the starting point. I'd like to know, why is it so abrupt? Why did she suddenly become so combative or so agitated? Is there a drug-drug interaction? Are there medications that have been changed that Todd has raised? As an emergency physician, I'm thinking, is there something else going on here that mom doesn't understand? We've got to be, I think, very sensitive about the fact that there could be something else going on besides an exacerbation of a pre-existing mental illness.
And that is a big part of our questioning, because we are the ones that find out the information for the officers. And did they have a recent medication change? You know, is this a normal behavior? Is it new? What's changed in her life? How is she going to respond if whether it's a mental health professional that shows up, an officer shows up, what's worked in the past? So we do a lot of that questioning because it is very important and it's a big part of our training.
Thank you all for these comments. I want to change the scenario just a little bit now. Let's assume that everything is the same, except we hear that, again, she has no weapons, but now she's screaming at her mother, "You just want me dead, but I'll kill you first." If that's the information that's conveyed over the 911 call from mother, how does it change things?
Well, if I may, from a law enforcement perspective, I still think that it's, unless there's, I think it's one of the things that law enforcement, again, should be on a standby situation. But I'm pretty sure that folks who have been in this in this line of work have heard, you know, concerning dialogue like that from the folks that they're counseling and that they're working with. But I again think that it should be a muted law enforcement response and just on standby for safety purposes. Again, in trying to make sure that the law enforcement responders are trained in CIT and other mental health response and de-escalation tactics, but I think it should still stay within the realm of a professional counselor.
Yeah, again, the same as with us. I mean, the staff are trained if a situation is escalating, that they know pretty much at what point they're going to need some assistance if they need it. But they will try, you know, at every cost to avoid that if they can. But there are situations when it could escalate, so it would still be the same approach at that point.
Yeah, I concur. I like the idea, and it kind of goes back to comments I myself and I think Pat made earlier. That's where a behavioral health professional, I think, is even more important. And again, maybe, you know, realizes, given the change in the situation, that maybe mom's a trigger, and so maybe we need to pull mom away from the situation and let the peer or the behavioral health professional take the lead. But again, I would agree with Steve and Brian. I don't think it rises to the level of law enforcement involved, because that could exacerbate a situation.
I guess from the standpoint of 911 again, and Mickey and Sabrina, is there a role for paramedics? Paramedics are able to help to assess the situation as well, along with a behavioral health interventionist. Is there a role for that tiered response to someone who's more escalating and perhaps may require or benefit from de-escalation other than a professional mental health professional?
I would agree with all the comments made. And again, one of the advantages of that co-response model, meaning a peer and a professional responding together, is that there are times when we may turn it over to one person while they're dealing with that situation, where maybe the peer would have the conversation with the mother and daughter, and while the psychologist may step away, contact police and just coordinate with them to be standby, or maybe to come a little bit closer to the home in case the conversation or the threats start to escalate more into behavior or action. It's a nice advantage. And I also like the point that Steve came up with. When we do our CIT training, and of course, when we would ask for officers to come, we would ask for CIT officers if there were people available at the time. But one of the things that we do our CIT training here, one of the things that we discuss with our officers is that often they will approach a situation and already have one strike against them with the client simply because they have their badge on, their law enforcement badge, and that presence may place an element into the situation that may be discomforting for the client. It may be upsetting to them. It may be fearful to them. But whatever the reasons are, we train our officers that they may walk into a situation with already one strike against them simply because of their uniform. And we talk about how to anticipate that with our officers, how to be sensitive to that, and also how to address or approach a situation, leaving behind their command presence approach, which has served them so well in terms of safety, but understanding our population to approach those situations in a different type of manner. So that, that speaks to the role of possible paramedics or EMS, where they may be able to have some different perspective from our clients and see those folks as more along the lines of a healthcare provider or someone that might be able to provide them with assistance or help, rather than, again, their perception of possible law enforcement being one to punish them or to take them into custody or arrest them. And just there's been some times when we've gone out on an MCOT mobile crisis outreach effort where we do include EMS, and they just provide an additional role, an additional presence that can be very effective and helpful with our clients. But again, just getting back to agreement with all the comments that we've heard so far, as this situation develops and maybe escalates to the daughter yelling about killing her mother, we still would not bring law enforcement in yet at that point, and still try to de-escalate and address that situation from the MCOT worker and the peer from that team to try to come up with some type of a resolution.
So we have a few more scenarios, but before we get to those, I just want to change this one a little bit more. And what if the 911 report call indicates that the daughter has a knife and has threatened to use it on mom if she enters the room?
Well, I think certainly, and again, from the perspective of an advocate, behavioral health advocate, I now think this rises obviously to the level of law enforcement intervention and or EMT. Safety has to come first and has to be a priority. But of course, we would want at least CIT trained officers as a part of that call, and not those who've not gone through a training or some sort of mental health crisis response training. But at that point, I think safety dictates law enforcement involvement. I should add, still with at all possible level the opportunity for the crisis response team, the behavioral health professional, and peers to be able to lead when safely appropriate.
Yeah, that's exactly the kind of scenario where we would send in a CIT trained officer. Our officers also have the ability to request Project Respond, which is our mobile mental crisis team that goes through the city. So Joint Respond. I did want to touch back on an earlier comment. In our jurisdiction, we would not send EMTs in without some kind of assistance. And that's also driven by our community's requests. The EMT in our jurisdiction, they don't have crisis intervention training. And their one method of control is chemical restraint. And that is not what people in our community want. So they aren't, it certainly doesn't, we have opportunities to do training with them, but they would not be the person we would, the group that we would lean on if we're trying to help someone in a mental crisis, a mental health crisis.
So if I may, this would be one of the situations that if you were asking me about 2 months ago or 3 months ago, I would have said, I would have absolutely agreed with Kevin and Melanie. And I still absolutely agree with them. My cause for concern now is today's current climate within law enforcement or the liability concerns. So when we look at things like sanctity of life and preservation and the new laws that are coming around, we are especially sensitive to make sure we don't put ourselves into a situation that we can escalate it. Is there a criminal act that actually happened? And so if we go into the situation where the person may be only a threat to themselves, and at this point we would probably, from a law enforcement perspective, ask mom to leave and then work on the de-escalation part of it from there. But now we're coming into things like national discussions of qualified immunity and everything else, and who's going to be responsible for what may happen, even though the intent here is good and trying to get help, but how it plays out. So now there are some serious concerns from our standpoint.
So we in that situation are very transparent with the person that we're working with and letting them know now it's raised to a little more of a dangerous climate for everyone, and we would want the mother removed. In addition, we'd alert the officer, but we would then say to the individual, look, you're escalating to a level where we're getting a little scared, we're getting concerned, we want everyone to be safe. We are going to ask the officer to come in, and he's going to come in, or she is going to come in, and we're going to try to still work through this, but we would try to keep that communication open and going with them.
I agree with the last two comments, and I think in all cases, validating the person's, the young lady's fears and validating her concerns and listening to the emotions and the things that she is saying is really, really critical. I also think at all levels, there should be some consideration for developing a crisis plan. And I'm coming back to the family. Oftentimes families, when they're calling 911, may not give the right information because they don't know how to articulate actually what is going on. And so from the dispatch perspective, the call takers, being able to know what questions to ask that parent or that caller, so that you can get the relevant information. The daughter may have threatened earlier that she wanted to kill her mom, and mom may not have articulated that on that first call. So I think it's important as from the call taker perspective to make sure that that family member is asked those questions that he or she may not be willing to divulge to you because of fear, because of embarrassment and other things. But I also think it's really important that they be left with a crisis plan. No family member is provided a roadmap or a toolkit to, especially in the early days, on mental illness and how to respond and how not to respond and how to be proactive. And I think that is something that has to be taught. If it can start at the crisis level, then I say start it there. But in all cases, I think the family should also be provided the support as well as the young lady of where to seek resources, some sort of a crisis plan, and recognition of triggers so that they can be more proactive rather than reactive.
I'm hearing, this is really great. I'm hearing not only the initial response, but the follow-up response is what I just heard for the family and for future I think that's an element that sometimes gets lost in these conversations. I think that's such an important element of the primary response. In this case, sounds like a team should be coming to the home, and then a follow-up response the next day, the following days, to help with the family's management of this for future considerations, to your point. Thank you.
And if I may, you just make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, because it's ultimately what resources can we bring to bear to help the family in the situations that they're dealing with. And if we can, and granted, there are always going to be outliers. There are going to be some families who, as Kevin has mentioned, they're triggering the problem. And there are going to be some families who are going to say, I'm not going to be part of it. You know, they may have different strained relationships with their loved ones. But if we can rally around families that, as we know, folks are dealing with, and assuming that these people in crisis do have support systems and families to begin with. But if we can find ways to rally around them and give them the resources and the training and the help to hopefully de-escalate the situations before they become an issue that crisis workers and law enforcement and EMS have to be responding in the first place, that should definitely be the first thing that we all try to do.
So thank you all very much for this discussion.
Michael?
I'm going to turn it over. Yes.
Sorry. I wanted to make one summary comment. Is one of the things that I heard too is that there is the importance of developing some type of trust, or as much as possible in the situation, where I hear Steve talking about, you know, being really transparent with the person in crisis. But I also think there's the importance of creating some type of trust with the family member as well, because I don't know, I'm a parent. If my child was in crisis and the police told me to leave and I was worried of what bad happened, I'd have a really hard time leaving. I'd really need to trust that I wasn't making my child less safe by leaving. So I think those are things that are really important too, in terms of the skill set of whoever is responding, to be able to make the people involved feel as safe as possible.
So this has been great. I'm going to turn it over to Jen for scenario 2. But as we go through these, you know, I'm hearing familiar terms like peers and law enforcement and EMS, which is all great. But as we think through these, I also want us to sort of pretend like we're in some weird alternate universe where police have not been invented yet, and the peer concept has not been invented yet, and EMS doesn't exist. And what would crisis response look like if we were truly starting from scratch, building what needs to be the crisis response rather than just using what we currently have available to us. I sort of want us to do both of these things at once. So Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Michael. So here's our second scenario. A call comes in to 911 about a man acting strangely in a public park at the center of town. He is yelling Bible verses, talking to someone who is not there, and alarming passersby. The caller indicates he is not threatening anyone. She is just mostly concerned that he needs help. So what response strategies and responder skills would be most important for responding to this call? What background, training should responders have, similar to how you engaged with the last scenario? I welcome anyone to jump in first.
We do a lot of training on trauma-informed practices, as well as motivational interviewing, as well as mutuality engagement of people. And we do work in many parks, actually, in our organization, where we meet people like this. And it really comes down to a kind engagement with the individual, and then excellent listening skills, not jumping to any conclusions, and just hearing that person out. And if it's just simply that they want to talk, you know, about their religion or whatever it is that they're doing, you know, there's no issue with that, really. It bothers other people because our culture has said, when you see that, it's aberrant behavior and we don't like it, but it doesn't mean that the individual is in any trouble or any danger at that point. So it's really just building the relationship with the individual.
In our world, this is not necessarily a call for service. because you can stand in the park and yell, and you know, you can respond in any way as long as you seem safe, and go right ahead. And in Portland, we're pretty good at that. We certainly have callers who are worried and they want to check welfare. But we really think long and hard about what is going to be helpful for the person. Are they in crisis, or are they just responding to stimuli that we don't know about? But I think in my perfect world, I think that if we had peers maybe, or a group of folks who are just, they know their neighborhood and they know the people in their neighborhood who would just drop by and check in, that would be the most that I would want to have happen, because they are allowed to be who they are. So I'd hate to intervene if someone doesn't need my help.
Up until this moment, I hadn't really thought about that, because the knee-jerk response is somebody calls somebody who might be needing help, paramedics are sent, and they're making an assessment. But to your point, Melanie, it's a really interesting dynamic of a community to respond to or not respond to someone who is in a situation where there's no harm, there's no difficulties, and I don't mean to sound snarky at all, but they may be listening to their headphones and they're just or talking on their cell phone. I think it's a really interesting element of responding to somebody saying somebody looks like they need help.
So this is a little outside of my normal lane, but I've been talking a lot with clinicians that work as crisis specialists. And one of the things that they tell me about is this: yes, there's this upfront problem or upfront lack of problem, but in talking with the person and listening to them, you can start to hear the undertones of a larger behavioral health issue. And so the benefit, I think, of having somebody with some kind of clinical experience, and that might be a peer or it might be just someone with clinical experience, a degree or whatever, that they may be able to, in talking to this person, pinpoint the underlying cause of what's causing the issue. And it may not be there. That may be somebody's cognitive normal, but maybe there is something that's there for them to address.
I like that comment. One of the things that we train our crisis team on is when we get called to a situation, there are two things we really want to look at. One, and foremost, is what do we do right now? Is there a crisis situation? Is there some type of risk? Is there an immediate need for intervention? Sometimes there is, sometimes there's not. But the first and foremost, we look at what do we do right now? And the second thing we look at is what do we do after today? And that just addresses, I think, the previous comment where, okay, this doesn't sound like an immediate crisis situation where there needs to be an acute intervention because there's some sort of risk or some dangerousness. Doesn't appear to be that. However, is there something we can do after today that may be helpful for that person should that present itself? The other thing we also want to look at is just to see if we can do anything to assist that person. If they're under some sort of distress or some type of environmental or situational stressor, is there anything we can do? Being a part of a community mental health organization, there are a number of different services we can provide from different levels of professionals, from case management, from peer services, from housing situations, financial situations, from that level all the way to medication management, and just try to evaluate and engage that situation to make sure that they don't have any immediate or acute needs that could be addressed and may be able to help de-escalate or solve some of the problems that could be contributing to their current situation.
Thank you. If I may add a new piece of information and adjust the scenario a little bit. So what if the caller says he seems kind of aggressive, jumping in front of people and yelling at them? Would this alter your response to how this situation should be addressed?
I think it would. The person may not actually be a danger. They're just going through some motions. However, the person that they're yelling at may perceive them as a threat and become violent towards them. And so they're putting themselves at risk at that point. And I would like to see more intervention at that point. Of course, the prior scenario, they have a right to read the Bible out loud if they want, but when it's escalated to the point of them threatening someone else, then I think the level of intervention does increase at that point.
What if the caller says that he is swinging a stick if people come near him?
I think now you're talking a public safety issue, and you probably need a response with an officer coming into the scene.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add, Steve, is I'd prefer it be at least a CIT trained officer, of course, and I knew you would agree with that, but I just wanted to add that in, that it would at least be a CIT trained officer, because we don't want to further escalate when not necessary, but we have to be mindful of the safety of the individual and the community as a whole.
Well, I agree again with everything. Over the last few months, lots has changed for us, and so then my question at that point become: yes, I'm extremely concerned about that, concerned about that person's well-being. I'm definitely cognizant that somebody else may react in such a way that's going to totally escalate the entire situation. But what happens after the police get there? If this person is in crisis, what happens after that response when law enforcement cannot stay there, or if the person does not want assistance or help or anything else? Now we're into a situation that the actions may not have elevated to the fact that that person needs to be arrested. And I would argue that person should not be arrested. They should be nowhere near the criminal justice system. But what happens? Do we forcefully put that person under care, that they are a danger to themselves or to another or anything else? So then those become the questions. And to me, this is all culminating into the fact and to an acknowledgement that we just are not investing in the resources that we as communities need to be investing in. For all the good that my panelists, my peers are doing, they're working bankers' hours, and they're underpaid and underappreciated to begin with in the first place. So now, it's again, I want to stay at where we're at, but the conversation and in its entirety it's grown to the fact that, licensed mental health professionals and peers are the ultimate answer. As soon as you call, we're done. And that's not true. And that's not fair to the people who have to deal with these very difficult and sensitive situations. So it's definitely one of those calls. And yes, law enforcement should be there, but what happens when that person says, I don't want you, get away from me, I don't want any help at all?
I think that's important. What we're not talking about is the follow-up and the follow-through. And we've created in our region the follow-up and the follow-through. With crisis stabilization, the officer then has a resource to say, hey, I can bring you to this stabilization center. It's a great place to go rather than jail or hospital. The peer could be there and reinforcing that at that point. Or if they didn't choose to go anywhere, the peer is still developing that relationship with the officer still there and say, well, it seems like if things have de-escalated to that level of safety, the peer can continue the conversation and then follow up as well, asking permission. Can I stay in touch with you? Can I show you other alternatives or other, modes of, care in the community? And we're also not talking about, the overall 8 dimensions of wellness that all of us live, which is work and spirituality and housing and all those good things that we have. We get into those conversations. We get into it deeply so that we can understand what this person is dealing with. So for me, it's all about the follow-up and the relationship continuing.
Thank you. I'd like to turn it back over to Michael for our final scenario.
Thank you, Jen. So this time a call comes into 911 from a woman who is crying and saying that she can't take it anymore. She says the world would just be better off without me. She indicates a plan to overdose on medication. She has a full bottle of pills, but has not taken them. She says she does not have any weapons. In this situation, what would the ideal response look like?
I think your number one person is your 911 call taker. It's important to be able to build that relationship with them, to try to determine what the real threat is, what's going on in their life, what's different today. We have the ability, like I said, we have crisis line. We can also, when we have people who are suicidal, we can bring an officer on the line and communicate together. But I think it's very important to try to build that relationship and do that de-escalation. So when whoever is going to respond gets there, that we have a good base level communication going.
So crisis hotlines and suicide hotlines are really good at stabilizing people with suicidal ideations, and they're a wonderful, non-invasive resource. The thing that bothers me about this scenario is that the first thing that our crisis line would ask is, are you safe for now? And that, I mean, she has the ideations and she has the means right there. That's a little nerve-wracking for me. And they would want to know, like, can you be safe while we have this conversation, while I send somebody, so that bothers me about this scenario.
You mentioned, Sabrina, you mentioned you're bothered by the methodology that she's contemplating?
No, that it's so readily available. So she's having the ideation, she has a plan, and she has the means right there.
Well, my response would be, if she has a gun, that's a different methodology than pills, given the fact that if she starts taking pills, there's still time. That's why I want to understand your differentiation with that. To me, if there's a gun, that is a more immediate outcome, as opposed to pills that have a much more gradual hours outcome, that you have more time, to your points about fine-tuning the triaging at the 911 level.
Well, that's assuming you know where she is. Yeah. I just want to say one thing, is I think it's important who's taking the call. Obviously she's been triggered, or she's had, something happen in the near, in her recent future, in her recent life, about maybe with a partner, be it male or female. I think it would be important to make sure those questions are asked maybe at some way at the front end. And then who is taking that call is really, to me, may really contribute to the outcome. And to your point, Dr. Hargarten, depending on where she is, those pills could be just as lethal as a gunshot if you don't know where she is and how to get to her.
No question about the fact that if it's 3 or 4 hours by the time you get to her, those are the 3-4 critical hours for a drug overdose. Absolutely. So it's a great point, Pat, that knowing where that person is and how quickly tiered response can get to that person in a good way is very, very important. I couldn't agree with you more.
So what if we change the scenario just a little bit? The call is basically the same, but this time the caller is a man. He's agitated, angry, and again says he wants to die. Would the response look different, or should the response look different?
I don't think male or female makes a difference in this. I think it's, you're still going to do the same thing. You're still going to try to de-escalate. You're going to try to understand, try to empathize. and determine what that best response. Can we get them to crisis line to talk to a counselor and create that safety plan, or is it imperative that we get one of our crisis trained officers out there with them in person?
We can also, we can patch in a crisis response police officer who can talk to them, and they have more training. If we can't get someone out to them, our CIT trained folks can be on the phone with them and de-escalate. And that's been really successful for 911 because we're able to step back and give over some assistance for someone who can arrive on scene if they need to, but also can make other recommendations, getting that person to a walk-in clinic or getting them connected to their clinician. Any other option they can utilize, they will, but at least they're mobile and they can go in and make contact if necessary.
And then finally, if we change it a little bit more, again, it's a man who's angry and agitated and suicidal, and now he says that he's sitting on his couch with a gun in his hand.
For some reason, Michael, I suspected that was going to be the next scenario, because that does change the equation to our previous comments. So I think that does escalate the response, or makes it a different tiered response.
It definitely, I think it definitely is going to require a response in person. But I think, in the meantime, again, like Melanie was even saying, we can get our crisis trained officers on the phone. We can start the de-escalation. They can start the response if we know where he is. We can get them there. And then we can conference an officer on the phone to transfer that relationship we've built trust with that caller, and now we introduce our friend the officer who can now come on and talk, and we've built that trust. They can continue that communication on scene and hopefully be able to talk that person out, talk them to a place where they are ready to just accept the help.
Let me ask, and then we'll move on. I know that we're almost out of time for this scenarios. Why are we talking officers right now and we're not talking about mental health? Is it because he has a gun and officers have guns, or what?
So it is, he has a gun, and then for us as officers, this becomes basically a barricaded suspect or a hostage negotiation type situation. It's the same tactics you would use whether you have hostages or not. But the gun is not only a threat to himself, but a threat to his neighbors and his community. And you're going to need to make evacuations, lock down the neighborhood, secure his movement, and protect the larger community. So that's why you're talking officers.
Thank you. Sounds like that's a skill set that currently only officers have or can do.
Yeah, I don't think I would want to put my staff in that kind of danger. That would be, I think, reckless for me to do. If we had another answer, I would love it, but I just can't risk that, putting staff into that harm's way, possible harm's way.
And I gotta admit, and that's a very good point. And nobody wants to put any of their staff, including me. I don't want to send them in that situation, and that's why. But there is an expectation from the public, and there is definitely an expectation from the family to do something for us to help. And so yeah, it unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but law enforcement would have to take the lead on something like that. And but I really like what Mickey's saying, that we don't have to go in there to potentially escalate the situation. If there's a way that they're willing to talk to us on the phone, that we can do that handoff and develop that rapport, that's the best way to actually come in there and do something like that. So that's a really good idea, and it's a very good way of doing things.
It's that verbal containment. If we can keep them talking, and hopefully just build that relationship until we can get them to a point where either we have a resolution, or if it's safe to walk away, let them cool down, and let Project Respond or some type of someone who can follow up with him, when he's sobered up or when he's calmed down a bit.
Yeah,
arrange that.
I definitely agree. It brings me back to days of peer support and policing, and those calls were normal for us. That instead of calling 911, our fellow officers were, back in Chicago would call up and say, I'm sitting here, I'm drunk, I'm looking at my pistol, and I think I'm going to do it. And what's weird is we go right into the house, but not in uniform and not armed and everything else like that. And, call me crazy. Obviously, yes, I picked a difficult line of work, but it really goes back to this to what I'm hearing is trust, and to what everyone's identified, and just to me hit it right on the head. It's how do you build that trust and that sense of security? Because to me, if I was going to do it, I'm going to do it. And but to me, and I haven't been in this world nearly as long as a lot of you all have. But to me, if somebody's telling me that they're getting ready to do something, there's still some kind of hope, and there's still a chance to reach that person.
I just want to, and I'm going to turn this over to Leah, but I just want to throw out the concept that we've all heard of suicide by cop. And, if the response is someone with a gun, then that is another potential means, right, of suicide. Just throwing it out, and I know that this whole gun aspect of the scenario makes it really complex. Thank you all for this discussion. It's been really rich and interesting, and I'm going to turn it over to my dear colleague, Leah.
Great. So I have the enviable task of summarizing where we are in the conversation. Super interesting comments. I really appreciate hearing from everyone. This has been a really rich discussion. I think if we look across the conversation and the scenarios, there are really three themes emerging that we can use to launch us into the next part of the conversation. So the first, by far, hearing from all of you, is really about engagement and de-escalation. How do you build trust in a situation and a sense of security, and really who is best positioned to engage with an individual in a specific crisis? And we heard from Mickey that really starts right from the start. So how do you build trust from the moment a 911 call is made, if the call is made, and then how do you transfer that trust across a chain of custody, so to speak, as different people come into the situation? As Steve mentioned, we're really thinking about how to engage people from with a sense of mutuality, being trauma informed. And then, as many people said, this sense of engagement really involves both the person that the call is about, as well as their family members. So needing to engage both the individual and their family members. The second theme that I think really resonates is kind of who has the knowledge or skills to solve the problem, or what resources can be identified. So this starts really at the beginning in terms of thinking about what questions are dispatchers asking and what have they been trained to ask, and are they able to access the right person to ask questions in an appropriate way. So for example, if a family member is at the scene, are they able to speak to that family member to get the information? Then thinking more broadly about what resources are available in the community to respond to that situation. And so again, kind of really at the point of triage, have those resources been mapped? Do we know who to call for what situation, and how quickly can they respond? And then a theme that also came up that I think is something that we talk less about, but seems equally important, is, are we thinking about follow-up right from the start? So after that primary response, have we identified who in the community wants to take the lead on following up after the crisis, the immediate crisis, has resolved, so that person or that family can be engaged, can do crisis planning for the future, and hopefully doesn't have another crisis situation. And then the last theme I'll hit on is a little bit about safety and what counts as a crisis. So I think it's a really interesting concept for us to go back to that situation of the person in the park, and think, we as communities are constantly assessing situations and making decisions about what counts as a crisis. And so obviously that's going to be different for different people. And the field of emergency response has to kind of field those calls and then make decisions about the best response, or if it even rises to the level of crisis. And I think sometimes that can be murky in the beginning, and then it sounds like, there are different tiers, and when public safety really starts to be called into question or at risk, then that's when the response needs to escalate. So as the scenarios got more serious and weapons were involved or specific threats to people, it was clear hearing from you that both to protect the individual or the family or the public, as well as to protect the responders who are responding to that particular situation, there would be an escalating response, usually involving police. So I don't know if any of my colleagues have anything they wanted to add on that. I think that provides kind of a high level summary of where we are. And Amy, I don't know, do you want to take it to the next section?
Sure. So going back to, I think, the summary of those scenarios and all the discussion, we can't really talk about mental health crisis response without considering where racial bias may come into play and considerations of race equity. And so I just wanted to take a little time to get input from the panel on what ways racial bias may come into play in the scenarios that we talked about, in terms of how a situation is interpreted initially and then responded to. So kind of from the beginning when that call comes in all the way through the people responding. And then also to think about a little bit on how we can mitigate some of that risk.
We've had some really deep conversations. We're still having conversations, so no change yet. Certainly we are aware of the intersection and the intersection. What I mean is that our callers are engaging their bias to get a response. So we understand that's happening. Unfortunately, we can't fix systemic racism in the 3 to 5 minutes that we're talking on the phone with someone, but we are having conversations about how to be aware that certainly our callers, we may need to ask some more questions to get a little bit more at the motivation for their call, because they may react differently to someone standing in the park yelling Bible verses based on their race. And the level of interaction, of course, we get the right help to the right place and at the right time. That's our mission. But trying to understand a little bit more about what goes in, what's happening before that call is picked up, is a conversation that we're having right now. And related, we're trying to identify, are there times when we don't need to get the description of the person in crisis? One of the examples given to the panel is, what if we're responding to someone's home, if police are going into someone's home, do we need a description of that person? We probably don't. You're going to be meeting with a family member, so it's going to be the person the family member points out. But it is such a common part of our process is to get a full description of someone. And so we're now looking at the reasons why we do that is just because we always have, is removing that information going to minimize bias on behalf of the responders? We don't know, but those are at our level, we're trying to figure out how we can mitigate some of the bias that's already built into the system that we are a part of.
So there's so many, I guess I'll say, levels to this conversation. First of all, Melanie, I absolutely appreciate your comments because, like you said, you don't know what the motivation of the caller is. I am clearly a proponent of CIT and CIT trained officers, and I am a trainer. One of the things that we talk about when we talk about verbal de-escalation, racial disparities, those kinds of things is, I can't change what's in your heart. That 40-hour CIT training or 5 minutes on the phone is not enough time for me to change your heart. So it's a much broader and much more complicated answer or response, because we really have to get into the conversation about systemic racism and not only what the caller's intention is, but even if the caller doesn't give you a description and say, well, it's an African-American male, when the officer arrives, they are going to see that. And that is a part of their experience. And what lens they see that through obviously has a huge effect and determines what their response is, and whatever bias he or she may have. So I wish I knew the answer. God, I know we all wish we did, but that's such a larger conversation. And how do we have all the players involved have a pure intent or look for a good outcome that's not skewed by not only race, but, sexual orientation, religion. I was thinking as Melanie was talking, and forgive me for going on, but I was thinking, what difference does it make in the scenario of the person in the park that's screaming Bible verses? Well, were they Muslim? Were they Catholic? Were they African American? How would that affect whether or not a call was made and what the response would be? Because unfortunately, those are all real factors that we deal with here in America. And I guess I say across the world, because I know we have some participants from Canada that I've seen in the chat room. But that's the reality of where we are.
If I may, yeah, that person, if that was a black man screaming in the park Bible verses, that was my grandfather. he would go out to preach, because that's just where his faith was. But I'm comforted by the word of systemic, because it's not just police. So in the response, it's not just cops showing up with a bias. I've seen fire ambulance, ambulance, EMS people dropping folks and not giving a rat's butt because of who I am assuming was laid out in that stretcher. I've heard counselors say things that they probably shouldn't have said. I've heard, it's all part of it. And to me, within anyone who serves the public, anyone in public service, I think, while we can't, like what Melanie was saying, and like what Kevin's saying, that we can't change the heart of where that person is. I think as we have those conversations about systemic racism and bias, we have to look at what I think the biggest threat to us is the burnout and the dehumanization of the people who sometimes, when we're having bad days, everyone here has been there. And so how do we guard ourselves against that? And how do we get to the point that any biases that we may hold don't eat through as we're serving those we're called to serve. So yeah, it's a very complicated situation.
I just like to comment on something that I've observed here in this panel and in other situations where race and bias are discussions, that the discussions are usually led, or the responses usually come from people of color. I would love to hear something from the panelists who are not African-American or represented from a community of color, on your thoughts.
Pat, I'll comment and just say that as this portion of the conversation was beginning, I found myself wondering why back in medical school and all through residency, I was taught to present a case to my attending, the nurses, to my colleagues. This is a 33-year-old African-American male. He has a history of diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. Or this is a 65-year-old Caucasian female. Like, it's the second thing we say. And this was how I was taught to present a case, and we always present cases that way. I don't know if medical students are still taught to present cases that way, but that's what I found myself thinking about as this conversation was started when Melanie was talking about what she's doing with her call takers.
Back 15, 16 years ago, I traveled around New York State meeting with people in services, and I went through psych centers, partial hospitalization programs, anywhere that anyone would listen to me or come together and we would talk. And the issue of the parity issue would keep coming up as people are treated differently in what we do. What I learned from that and what helped me to create an organization that is more sensitive to that is that I heard the story of Howie the Harp, which was a peer-run organization in New York City in Harlem. And it was started by a Caucasian man, Howie, who wanted to do something in the peer community. And when he opened, nobody came to his drop-in center. And he realized what he did was he brought his friends who were also Caucasian to work in the drop-in center, so he wasn't inclusive of his environment. And the first thing I did was looked at my staff pattern and looked at my staff and said, is my organization inclusive of the environment I'm in? And I made sure that it is that. And I also made sure that we had some equity training to understand that poverty is poverty and it doesn't matter who that person is. Trauma-informed practice is what it is, and it doesn't matter who that person is. And we made a conscious effort years ago to really work on that. And I have to say that I think there's still a long way to go. But what's helped is with my CIT training and I coordinate the CIT training here as well, is that implicit bias is now a piece of it. But then it goes even further after that training to where we brought in a trainer who does implicit bias for the police and continues past the 40-hour CIT training. And our county exec of one of the counties said, I want this for all the police in the county. And now they're infusing that into. So I think it's having the word and the will and the leadership to understand what you're up against, looking at your history of your community, not forgetting the history and making the changes that are necessary.
There's something I want to say, but I'll probably get in trouble, so I don't think I should just say it. I think that again, what it's not, yeah, the police are a symptom, but yeah, all right, I'm just gonna say it. What's the common line about racism? What group? All right, so it's not police thing. I see in somebody's comments that we're talking about. It's not a mental health compartment. It's not. What's the underlying denominator? All right, let's just be real about that. So as we all sit up here and have these real conversations, let's everybody take our medicine for it. All right, and let's not tiptoe around the issue of it's this group, say that about them. And I'm not saying this is what's being happened, but I tell you what it feels like to me, and it feels like, thank God you're concentrating on them. Don't look at me. And I'm sorry, that's just how I feel about it. But what I am encouraged about is the people that I've had the opportunity to serve with, whether it was in New Mexico, Chicago, here in Vermont, and being blessed with dealing with the wonderful people who are on the CIT International. It's just the passion and the empathy and understanding that all people are people. And that's what gives me the hope. And while I think that people in key positions can do dangerous harm and bring us back in so many different places, there are so many other good people who are pushing to do the right thing. And I'm just glad to be part of that movement and proud to serve with the folks on this panel and everyone else who's doing work to bring back humanization and empathy to everyone.
Well, and if I may, first of all, Brian, I really appreciate you and your honesty and transparency, as well as everybody else. Here's the thing. And I'm gonna kind of walk back a comment I made earlier when I said I can't change your heart, because I can't do it in 5 minutes, but I've been a part of situations in training where when we're willing to engage, and I think systemically the problem we have is we're so afraid to have this conversation. And Pat, I appreciate you saying, because you're right, more often my experience is when we're having the race discussion, it's normally people of color who are speaking, and quite frankly, white people who are more reluctant. And I understand why that is. Don't get me wrong, I understand why that is. But we have to have these conversations, because when we do, we're able to start to break these barriers down. I had, like I said a few seconds ago, I'm going to walk back my comment about I can't change your heart. I've had conversations with not just officers, because I don't, I want us to be careful, not because there are many different people, and we're really talking about people, like Brian said, we're talking about people. It doesn't matter what badge you wear, or what title you wear. We have to have the conversation about race in this country, because when we do, and when we do that face to face, the barriers start to come down. I am a product of, I grew up in, obviously, well, I shouldn't say obviously, I grew up in a situation where it was interesting. We were the first African-American family on our street when we moved in, now to a city that is 97% African-American. So that's been the swing in my lifetime. But when people are able to talk, and my dad, who was a World War II vet, said, good people recognize good people. And we can only do that through dialogue. We can only do, and again, that's not just about race, that's about any bias we may have, whether it's religious, sexual preference, all of those conversations. That's when we're able to change people's hearts. That's when we're able for you to be able to see me as a human being, regardless as to whether you wear a badge and a gun, or if you're a behavioral health professional, or if you're a faith leader. You're just able to see Kevin, and then we're able to provide me with whatever help, treatment, resources that I need, and not have them impacted by the color of my skin and those other things. So to me, that's the essence, that's the root cause we ultimately need to get to.
This is an extraordinary conversation, and I just want to add my perspective as an emergency physician, and to comment on Michael's initial comments about how we were trained in medicine. Emergency medicine is the first specialty of medicine that was started by patients' needs. It didn't matter your age, your race, your orientation, your religion. If you're in need, you're in crisis. And this has been a development that I'm very proud of being part of, but there's still so much work to be done. And I think one of the elements that I've learned is that it takes a team approach to help make these things happen. So I've, in my career, worked very closely with police officers, worked very closely with social workers and psychiatrists to help make the best decisions for my patients. And so this is such an important conversation that I cannot, as an emergency physician, somehow truncate my care because of the color of somebody's skin and their religion. I'm agnostic to that. As an emergency physician, I'm here 24/7 helping people in crisis. And I think this conversation is so important to get us to the next level that we all need to get for our communities.
I really appreciate all these comments, and I really, one of the things as we were putting this together, really wanted to make sure we had time to really have this conversation. And part of it is I really see in the work that I'm doing as we're developing and looking at different models, some of what we develop has the potential to actually increase race and equity. And so making sure that as we're considering what we should do, that we avoid that pitfall and actually implement things that will reduce race inequities. But when I see people talking about non-law enforcement responses, it's often when it's safe to do so. The problem is that there's a lot of bias that goes into when it's safe. So thinking about how we can continue the conversations and get people to the table to have these conversations as we move forward gives us our best hope of not doing things that are actually going to increase race inequities as we develop things that will serve some communities, but we continue to send only police to other communities because of how we assess risk. So I really appreciate people's willingness to have the discussion. I'm going to move a little bit to sort of our last phase of the discussion. So, you know, as we've talked about, you know, we know that there's all these different models that are being implemented. We have CIT, which we know has some benefits. There are co-responder teams, which the research suggests can have some benefits as well. There's mobile crisis. So we have these different models out there. But at this point, you know, really, you know, what we have so far hasn't adequately addressed the issues that we're seeing in communities or been responsive to all communities. So what we want to do is really think about what we might do if we didn't have any of these existing models, if we didn't have, you know, professionals that we relied on to respond to crisis right now. What would we build? What would we create to respond to mental health crisis events in the community? And I'll hand it over to Leah and Michael.
Yeah, so this is where we get to use our imagination. Obviously, there are, as Amy said, a number of emerging and established responses out there. But we, as the four of us who are organized this, have been thinking for a long time of kind of just by virtue of how things develop, they're all constrained by history. And so are there ideas if we could kind of erase what we have and build from scratch, what would we do? Are there things outside of the box that we should be thinking of, or new types of professionals or new types of training? And so I'd really kind of start broadly and ask all of you for any kind of inspiring ideas you've had to think about what would you build if you were to start from scratch. And maybe I'll just put kind of the caveat, since there was in the previous discussions kind of a clear indication that certain safety issues do require police response. Maybe we, in this imagination exercise, think about situations that are, at least we can agree, don't clearly require police as the primary response.
I'd like to jump in, and can we do some stigma training for kids? Because I can tell you a lot of our calls come from someone's stigma around mental illness. And if they don't call 911 because they know how to build communications and understand their own stigma, then we don't get in this process. So in my dream world, I think we need to do a lot more education around the stigma of mental illness and building people's resiliency and ability to solve problems at the lowest level. That's the first part of our dream world.
Yeah, I would echo that. You know, at NAMI, we have a program called Ending the Silence, and it's an anti-stigma program for schools, primarily in junior and senior high schools. Of course, I would love to roll it back even into elementary schools, elementary school age youth, because I believe it starts from the ground up. You know, it's just, you know, as parents, we say, if you don't require your child to clean their room until they're 16 years old, what makes you think they're going to start doing it then? You know, I've gone all my life without doing it. So I think we need to have that conversation. The stigma around mental health absolutely has to change. One of my mottos is, you know, stigma is the leading barrier that prevents people from seeking help and receiving the early diagnosis and treatment that leads to better outcomes. We have to change that. And we need to do it in a way that's not so heavy or threatening. You know, it's almost like the conversation we were just having about implicit bias or racism. There's similarities or parallels when we talk about our behavioral health. we're so afraid, one, we're so ignorant, and I mean that respectfully. We're so ignorant about behavioral health care, what resources are available, what treatment is available, what long-term prognosis or outcomes can be. We're so afraid of that conversation that we don't have it. And so it always becomes a crisis response. It becomes a very heavy conversation that that drives the stigma. So I believe in prevention. What do you do to mitigate as much as possible, and have people understand that their behavioral health, of course, is just as important as their physical health. And that combined with, I have to keep going back to Pat, having a crisis response plan is really important, but having that proactively, understanding if this happens, we have a better understanding of how to deal with it before it becomes a crisis, before it becomes a house on fire. And so we have to do that by starting younger. And my last comment is this, to that point, a lot of my experience has shown me that parents are more the perpetuators of stigma than children are. Again, I'm in and out of junior and senior high schools a lot. I talk to young people a lot. They're much more comfortable talking about their behavioral health, their experiences, their needs, than us parents are. We're the perpetuators of what happens in this house stays in this house. We're the perpetuators of, we're going to pray it away. We're the perpetuators of that, not so much our young people.
I sort of found myself wondering, I assume EMTs are licensed. So we have this whole licensed profession around medical emergency response. And why don't we have a licensed profession around, mental health emergency response? It just seems like there's a missing profession, if you will.
I think if it was a perfect world, it wouldn't start. Mental health wouldn't have started in a prison system, and that's where it really started. Was the asylums were really more prisons than they were treatment centers, and that's years and years ago. If it was a smarter approach, similar to what we did with AIDS when that started coming around, HIV, billions of dollars went into research to mitigate, to figure out how to address it. You can get the COVID's an example. Research went into it, vaccines were developed. Mental health never had the respect it deserved in the research world. It gets money, sure, there is research, yes, but it's not the amount of research that really should be going into it to find out where you would start in treating someone better. People talk about evidence-based practice. Unfortunately, many of us have to do practice-based evidence because sometimes that evidence-based practice scientifically doesn't adhere to everyone that you're serving. So you have to try different things. And I think being open to it, eliminating stigma altogether, is a better approach of working with individuals, because the mind is very complex. But again, if we had the research that it deserved, I think we would be light years ahead of where we are. But you would have to remove, our history, unfortunately, is the stigma of a punitive system of care. And if we could eliminate that and look at it more proactively and more of a response than a reaction, I think it would build a better system overall.
Okay, in my perfect world, mental health and behavioral health those terms would not exist. Since these are illnesses of the brain, I would love to see it under neurology, period. I would also like to see education started. I think it may have been Melanie at the elementary level. Let's teach it in science the way we teach every other organ. Let's talk about the brain and what happens to the brain when it gets sick. I'd like to see 24/7 access to care, not just crisis care, but to care with soft serve ice cream, chocolate.
I want to live in Pat's community. 24/7 access to ice cream. What a great thing to do to complement to this. This is so terribly important. Again, I'm thinking a lot of this is a history of reductionism, of separating artificially. When you're physically ill, you got a broken ankle. Well, what about your emotional injury that you've just experienced? And we fragmented care, we stigmatized care. We've got to pull that care into a unifying platform of people in the spectrum of crises. And the spectrum of crises is a 77-year-old who's angry and violent towards their caregiver daughter to a 17-year-old who's acting out and is angry towards their mother. So there's this spectrum. And I guess I'm concerned that in that process of not paying attention to mental health services, behavioral health services, that we haven't unified our community response so that we're not so busy trying to dissect what do we think this patient needs or this person needs, is that we have a holistic response and we devise that amongst the communities that we serve. And there may be some different variations as we're seeing even on this call. And so a community makes the decision. We're not making these artificial reductionisms about people's health, holistic health, and they have access to ice cream 24/7. That's great.
I think more wraparound support too for the families, where the families have resources at the school level, just everything throughout the steps of their lives, maybe church or other organizations that they interact with, that they actually have a care team. So when their family members in crisis and it's exceeded their capabilities of caring for that person, they have people they can reach out to. I know that there's a lot of wraparound programs out there, but I also know there's a lot of families that aren't connected to any of them. And just making it more readily available and more known for them so they can access that care.
I love all this discussion about sort of things that hopefully will prevent people from coming to the point that there's a 911 type crisis call. I want to shift things a little bit though, to think about, I guess, to narrow it down to if we're thinking about still needing someone to be a crisis responder, and we were building the crisis responder from scratch, what are the qualities, skills, and training that we would give this person? So not thinking about what professional field they're in, but what is it that we want this person to be like and know how to do?
Communicate openly. Sorry, Pat.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Be able to de-escalate, understand that the physiological reactions that people have to whatever their diagnoses may be. What are some of the underlying causes of these behaviors, understanding them, being able to communicate with them, and just get them to that help.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
I like to see them be compassionate and empathetic. I also think, and I don't know if this is done, I think those that are serving in crisis should themselves undergo some sort of a psychological evaluation and assessment to make sure that they are able to effectively triage crisis calls. And I also think that an annual assessment and time off. I mean, not just for clinicians and those that are serving, but I also feel the same for law enforcement. There should be some level of self-care written into any training or whatever. But I'd also like to see some of these crisis responders actually spend some time in the role of perhaps a patient in a hospital so they can understand what it's like to have your liberties taken away from you in a psychiatric setting. And I think that would increase some empathy and have a very intimate knowledge of the community you're going to serve.
Well, I would add all of those things, including the ice cream. And I saw a question in the chat about, do they need a PhD or a graduate degree? No, I'd like to see someone with lived experience. So you have that combination of compassion, inclusive of training, inclusive of all the things that Pat just talked about. You want to make sure that that person is able to carry out those duties. Frequent recertification, because one of the things we're learning in suicide prevention, especially in schools, is that a lot of behavioral health professionals get very minimal suicide prevention training or a suicidal response, and they don't refresh it. I had it once 20 years ago, I'm good to go, and that's not always true. But lived experience, I think is critical. So that would be my ideal person or respondent.
If I may, I'll just really quickly, again, so many talking on good ideas and things. I do all of that, but then I'd also add the one thing that's probably beyond the control is just some type of support from the community at large, because it's really easy for a lot of folks. You know, it's difficult in the public, and I'm not trying to be cynical and I'm not trying to whine about it. It's difficult for a lot of folks who are in this service related field to, oh, there's the problem, go out and do something. Great, I've done my job, you know, but that requires a lot of support, and that requires a lot of that's what we need. That's what folks who are doing that type of work, because it is so draining, and not everybody wants to do it, and there's a reason for that. So it requires a lot of support, I guess, from the external, from the committees, the communities.
Can I follow up on that? It's a great point. I'm thinking, how does the community get to have a hand in who the responders are?
I think Portland has been quite active, and going back before we met with the DOJ, we've been really active in lobbying for different groups of people to help people in crisis. So I see that the communities just, they can speak up. Even policing looks like the way the community wants it to look. So if we want people in crisis to be treated a certain way, we need to gather around and talk about that and engage with the people who are doing that kind of hiring. We have a very clear idea about who's going to be a CIT officer, and that came from community involvement. So communities can get engaged right now.
It sounds to me like we're talking about some kind of mechanism for accountability and transparency. And while that is kind of fairly normalized these days, like, government is more accountable and more transparent than it has been in the past. And I'm not always sure that that feeling of transparency extends in when you start talking about healthcare. You know, and of course you have the limits of HIPAA, and of course you want to protect patient privacy, but some methodology, I think, of accountability and ways that communities can provide feedback and some kind of reckoning for, you know, and maybe it would be helpful for families, because whenever we hear from NAMI family members, the story always seems to start the same. I tried to be an advocate and I was shut out. I tried to ask that, you know, I know what my son or my daughter needs, and I asked for it and I was denied. And so some way to bring pressure for that, some way to give the community a voice, I think would help them to become more involved.
Well, interesting comment, Sabrina, because I remember being the caregiver advocate for my adult son, who was diagnosed with serious mental illness. And in some situations, not all, I had his healthcare providers who would say, well, I can't discuss with you specifics of his case due to HIPAA, but I can tell you in a situation similar to this, we would have done that, this, or we can do this, or you should take a look at that. So there's this, and I really appreciated that. There has to be this a sense of compassionate give and take where we're respecting the rights and the privacy of the individual, but and forgive me, I hate to, well, I don't hate, I'm not going to apologize for keep wearing my NAMI hat. One of the things I love about NAMI and what attracted me to NAMI is education and support programs like Family to Family, because Family to Family, and I have this conversation with professionals all the time, and I said, here's the benefit. This is how this is how I would sell a Family to Family program to one of your social workers, clinicians, psychiatrists, psychologists. Family to Family helps caregivers understand better what that individual is going through, what the symptoms are, maybe an opportunity to see what they're experiencing through that lens, how you can be a better caregiver, how you can be better understanding. And then there's this self-care component that I really like. And I mean, it goes back to the old saying, if you don't care for yourself, you can't care for others. So that's one of the things that I absolutely love about NAMI and that program. And if there are others out there, great. When we come to the community though, and I just had this conversation with the assistant chief of police here in Detroit. And when we talk about CIT, there's a community buy-in component that's really important. And forgive me, my memory's fading. I'm not going to say I'm getting older. But the really important piece of CIT is that, and I keep forgetting the term, the oversight, the after, where this is where we develop, and I think Brian was hitting on this a little bit earlier. Being a law enforcement officer in particular right now is really tough now. And one of the tools to help mitigate some of that is community involvement. And for the community to understand that there is a group of people who are law enforcement, behavioral health care providers, doctors, judicial, who are all a part of that oversight to say, how did we do this month? How did we do in our crisis response? Did we respond properly? Where could we do better? That's really important. And it's almost like marketing. And I don't mean to use such an antiseptic term, but you need that community buy-in. You need that community, not just buy-in, but understanding, because it helps improve the understanding of what was done, what should be done, what could be done better, what resources are available, who's at the table. All of that is really important, that the community have that understanding and be engaged in this conversation. And I think that benefits everybody.
Well, thanks everyone. This is really interesting and helpful. I wish we had several more hours. I know we are coming close to the end of our session. We only have a couple more minutes. Amy, do you want to open it up to Q&A?
Sure. So people can raise their hand if they have a comment, or you can put a question in the Q&A. So, and if we do run out of time and people have things in the Q&A, I just want to point out that we will have some ability to respond to that after the session. And all of the panel members are registered for the conference, so you should be able to contact people individually as well.
So Steve, there's one question and you will have about 90 seconds, 60 seconds to answer it. So I'm giving you a tough job, but one question that's come in so far is if you could talk about, from your perspective, how the experience and trajectory differs when someone goes to a peer respite versus a hospital.
Well, easily put, it's like going to a bed and breakfast with a 5-star service. And I mean that. The staff are very welcoming, engaging. It's the approach of what happened to you, not what's wrong with you. The houses are full of professional instruments, professional art equipment, things for people to do while they're at the house, but also learning the resources of the community so that if they have a crisis the next time, they'll know where to go and where not to go, what's going to work for them. And it is all person-centered. It's not telling them what they can do, but it's giving them opportunities and choices of what they can do.
Great. Thank you. I'll let Amy close it out, but I did want to mention, as Jen said, there is a session at 5 for people who want to continue the discussion that Inga is hosting.
Is that the mental health special interest group? So if you want to look at it, it's a meetup. So I encourage people to attend. I just want to thank all of the panel members for taking the time to participate in the panel and sharing your perspectives. I also want to thank the workshop attendees. I've seen some great conversations as well in the chat. And we really planned this to be the beginning of a conversation where we plan to continue this conversation and really do some work kind of further exploring and talking to different groups and really thinking through, what could crisis response look like? We have an opportunity now potentially to really make some impact. So stay tuned. We hope to continue the conversation. And again, thank you all. And if you have additional questions, please do reach out to the facilitators, the 4 of us that put this together, as well as the individual panelists are all registered. So you should be able to contact them through the Whova app. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to the 4 organizers. This was great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.